Hi, I'm Pestilent, and I'll be going through the Unholy DK changes for the current Legion Alpha build. There has been almost a complete rebuild of the class, so I'll cover the new rune mechanics, spell changes and talents with some initial thoughts on their use. I've not had the chance to level up to see if the artifact weapon does anything interesting, but I'll give it its own video once I have. I'm going to start covering runes in town, as I need a dummy to explain, but the footage thereafter is going to be general questing in Stormheim, so I'll let you know when to minimise the video if you don't want any zone spoilers. By now you've probably noticed the floaty resource UI thing hooked under the player. It's a great addition, but I have no idea how to configure it, and it tends to move about with the camera, which is kind of irritating. Okay, let's start on runes. They still generate 10 runic power each, but all the different flavours are gone. There is just one type now. This is a big mechanical change, which has in turn caused several other changes. The tooltip says one of each recharges every 10 seconds, where I assume each means pair, but it's wrong. There are no pairs. Instead, what we have is a single block. You can still use all 6 at once, but you will only recharge 3 at a time. It doesn't matter which 3, as there are no pairs. Any runes you have down, 3 will always be recharging. What this means in practice is that if you use your runes the instant they become available, you will only ever be using the same 3 to 4 runes, with rune 5 being used occasionally and 6 almost never recharging. This is really quite forgiving, because with just a single flavour and no pairs, it's not possible to break runes 1 to 3 through desyncing, because any delays immediately push what would be lost recharging time onto runes 5 and 6, resulting in no loss of total runes. But of course, if you don't have 3 recharging, you are losing recharge time, which is now the only metric to check rune usage. There's still some things to talk about with runes, but I don't need the dummy anymore, and just standing here isn't that interesting. So if you don't want to see Stormheim, minimise the video. The method of regenning runes has been limited to Runic Corruption, which has a 1% chance per runic power spent to increase regen by 100% for 3 seconds. Runic Empowerment has been forced upon Frost, and Bloodtap has been removed completely. This to me is an absolutely absurd decision, because all the complexity of using Bloodtap was in not making a mess with the different rune types, or delaying them with bad timing, and all of that has been solved. With only one type, you can't orphan them, and with no pairs you can't desync them. All the risks of failure have been completely removed. You would get a far better user experience trying to control RNG with Bloodtap on both specs. The other major change to runes is that the 30% base haste has gone, and it's back to a flat 10 seconds reduced by haste on gear. And you need to stack haste, otherwise gameplay is a genuinely painful experience. But the total time between runes is random due to only having access to Runic Corruption, so I'm spending a lot more time simply waiting for runes. I might not be sitting idle whilst I wait, but I really don't care about using more death coils as filler. Also on the subject of haste, the global cooldown has been changed from 1 second to 1.5 seconds, reduced by haste, which I'm not overly happy about, but that will all depend on how much haste we have at max level. Right, so let's start going through the ability changes. I'll begin with the 2 core abilities that directly follow on from runes, Festering Strike and Scourge Strike. But since runes are now identical, they've had to remake Festering Strike to try to keep it dictating whether you choose to Scourge or Fester. Fester still costs 2 runes, but it now inflicts 1 to 3 festering wounds on the target. These stack to 5 and last 15 seconds. It's simply a debuff that sits there until it's popped by Scourge Strike, whereupon it deals damage and generates an extra 3 runic power. Scourge Strike is basically unchanged apart from its interaction with Festering Wounds, so as long as you can count to 5 you should be okay dealing with it. As for runic power, we have 2 abilities. We still have Death Coil, which still deals shadow damage and costs 30 runic power, but it now also restores 10 energy to the ghoul, increasing the rate the pet uses Claw. You can't cap your ghoul's energy spamming Death Coil as there is no cooldown on Claw, but they did take away the healing component, so you cannot target your pet or anyone else. Death Strike has moved from costing 2 runes to 40 runic power, which is freeing up the harder hitting runes, but this is doubling the cost of Death Strike as it now costs 4 runes to fund. It heals 40% of damage taken in the last 6 seconds or a minimum of 7% hit points. It currently does more damage than Death Coil but is physical, whilst costing 10 more runic power and lacking the extra pet energy. Even with the 10% extra chance to trigger Runic Corruption, Death Coil would likely remain the main runic power dump, especially as mastery levels increase. Diseases have also been simplified down to 1, Virulent Plague. This ticks shadow damage every 3 seconds for 21 seconds, so 7 ticks. The first tick is 3 seconds after cast, but for some reason it currently lasts 35 seconds and ticks twice at the end, but that'll get cleaned up. It erupts when the target dies, dealing damage in an 8 yards AoE split evenly, with a 30% chance to erupt on dealing damage. The dot damage is low, and the erupt damage is only slightly larger, and since it's split evenly, it's overall pretty weak. Eruptions damage the infected target that triggers it, but unfortunately, eruptions don't seem to trigger more eruptions. Having low dot damage isn't necessarily a bad thing because it means we can be balanced around active effects we control rather than long duration passives like this. Virulent Plague is put up by Outbreak, which costs 1 rune, deals a small amount of damage, and puts what is basically Unholy Blight on the target for 6 seconds, spreading Virulent Plague to all nearby enemies for the duration. One of the biggest changes has been to AoE. It is now all focused on Death and Decay, which still costs 1 rune, has a 30-second cooldown, and deals damage over 10 seconds. Except that now, while standing within D&D, Scourge Strike hits all nearby enemies, which basically means you drop everything and spam Scourge Strike. This is good for stronger snap AoE than we currently have, but Blood Boil has been removed, and if you want to AoE outside of this time, you have to take a talent. This is a pretty big red flag, with so much of WoW being mobile, being limited to AoE for not only 10 seconds out of 30, but being fixed in place as well, really worries me. Tanks are notorious for dragging mobs out of D&D. So these are the changes to the core abilities. I'll just quickly cover the other spell changes before taking a closer look at the probable rotation. Anti-Magic Shell has been nerfed. It's a 60-second cooldown and only covers 30% of health. Chains of Ice is 1 rune with a 70% snare for 8 seconds, but has no damage or disease. It's very weak for costing a rune. Dark Transformation has been changed to a 60-second cooldown with a 20-second uptime. No requirements to trigger it, but the added pet damage of this ability is underwhelming given it's still our only short-term burst. If this contained something that directly increased player damage, like Pillar of Frost, I would be much happier with it. The Runeweapon comes with a spell called Apocalypse, which has a 45-second cooldown, a short cast time, and puts up 3 Festering wounds. But I'm not thrilled with it having a cast time as it's awkward to use. Presences have been removed, so Death's Advance has been changed from an active to the 15% move speed passive we had from Unholy Presence, resulting in even less mobility, if you ever thought such a thing was possible. There are numerous abilities that have gone. Dark Sim is a PvP talent, Empower Runeweapon, Horn of Winter, Icy Touch, Plague Strike, Soul Reaper, Strangulate, and Necrosis as multi-strike has gone. The other abilities are unchanged, and the mastery is still shadow damage. The pet ghoul Timmy is still there, with no changes to his abilities, and is just pointlessly fulfilling his role as passive DPS with no utility or purpose. I don't want his DPS to go up, because if a pet does too much DPS, the player simply becomes its chaperone, and all you end up doing is pressing buttons to keep yourself busy whilst the pet does all the work. Which follows the same thing as diseases. The higher the passive DPS, the lower our active DPS will be within the grand total. And we need as much controllable DPS as possible to be competitive against other classes. It would just be nice if the pet had some value. Okay, that covers spell changes. Let's take a look at the initial cast priorities without talents. So what are the general ideas that we can infer from the available information? Well, put diseases up with Outbreak, keep Virulent Plague up 100%, Festering Strike to generate the Festering wounds, then trigger these with Scourge Strike, dump Runic power with Death Coil, and use cooldowns for what you could generally call burst. And that's it. Building up the priority system, it seems reasonable to put in 2 basic assumptions to start. 1, that we generate all Festering wounds with Festering Strike, and 2, we only Scourge Strike with Festering wounds up. But we are still limited to 3 runes per turn. Putting up Festering wounds requires 2 are used on Festering Strike. 1 is left for Scourge Strike, so the total number of Festering wounds will always be reduced by 1 at the end of each turn, and you obviously require a minimum of 3 Festering wounds to use all 3 returning runes on Scourge Strike. So we can quickly see that you repeat Fester Scourge until ending a turn with 3 or 4 Festering wounds remaining, and then Scourge 3 times. Rinse and repeat. Following this logic, it's not possible to end a turn in a situation where you exceed the 5 wound cap and waste some. So that's all there is to it. But there is an issue with Festering wounds duration of 15 seconds and rune regen being so slow. If you have 4 wounds on the target and use 3 Scourge Strikes, the wound remaining will likely have dropped off by the time you can refresh the duration with Festering Strike, because the rune regen time is too long without getting lucky with Runic Corruption. And watching Festering Wounds drop off for no fault of your own is kind of irritating. When it comes to AoE, we are severely limited, compared to other classes, and even to Frost. You throw D&D on the floor, and Scourge Strike everything near your target, which is great in theory, but there are a few issues. With no forward planning, we only have the 3 runes, and we need to use 1 for D&D, 1 for Outbreak, leaving just 1 rune for Scourge Strike. So if we want to do any kind of AoE DPS, we need to stop using rune abilities up to an entire rune cycle before adds arrive. And because we are lacking Blood Tap, we aren't able to store up runes and more importantly use the stored global cooldowns of useful abilities to cover the recharge time of the returning runes. If you are expecting that this is where the talent tree would fill up the remaining time with active abilities, I'm afraid it doesn't. Talents have been completely overhauled, and we have lost the mediocre amounts of healing, survivability, and mobility that was once in it. So on that cheery note, let's start on talents. 56. All will serve. Your Raised Dead summons an additional skeletal minion, and its cooldown is removed. This is just a passive, uncontrollable pet with no abilities. I kind of struggle to see the point. But if it actually does something useful, I would be all for it. Bursting Sores. When a Festering Wound bursts, it also deals 20% of its normal damage to all enemies within 8 yards of the target. I'm assuming the idea is to help active AoE. It also affects the target that triggers it, giving a flat 20% increase to wound damage on single target. There is little point going through the numbers, but it's about 10% of attack power, which is too low. It's not overly exciting, but its redeemable quality is that it isn't split evenly. You can also do a tiny bit of planning for AoE burst. Because Scourge Strike cleaves, you can put Festering Wounds up on multiple targets ahead of D&D and then trigger them all with a single Scourge Strike, assuming of course they haven't dropped off by that point. Ebon Fever. Virulent Plague deals its damage 50% more frequently. So rather than ticking every 3 seconds, it ticks every 2, resulting in an extra 3 ticks by 20 seconds. And more ticks increases the chance for more eruptions, which also damage the infected target, but since they are split evenly, it's kind of weak, and could lose out to Bursting Sores at some point. 57. Infected Claws. Your Ghoul's Claw attack has a 50% chance to cause a festering wound on the target. Looks dull, but is currently a pretty strong talent because it solves a number of issues, primarily because this is an external source of wounds that refreshes the current duration, which means you can finally roll over unused wounds between rune sets, basically making it a required choice. Another is down to how the pet uses Claw. It costs 40 energy, but triggers at 75 with no cooldown beyond the global, which means you have energy for a claw that you can trigger manually if you are trying to roll over a festering wound or need an extra one to determine how you use a set of runes. But you then have to wait for the energy to go back up to 75 before it's auto-cast again. It would be worth waiting for the claw to auto-cast at 75 and then force a cast, or you need to force 2 casts because if you force claw at the start and then wait for an auto-cast, you have to wait for it to recover 45 energy rather than just the 5 you would need after it auto-casts. You aren't gaining any extra casts, you just get a 50% chance for the extra festering wound when you need it. So this changes the decision making when your runes are recharging onto 2 festering wounds. You would be using Festive Scourge this turn because you are missing 1 festering wound for 3 Scourges. But rather than opening with Festering Strike, you would lead with Scourge Strike and try to game Claw to see if you could get an extra wound to pair with both waiting runes. If you don't, then you'd simply Festering Strike like you were going to before. Pestilent Pustules. Festering Strike now applies 1 to 5 festering wounds. The runic power gained from triggering a festering wound is increased by 3. This basically increases the average festering wound per festering strike from 2 to 3. But since the cap is 5, there is very little breathing room. You will be overcapping wounds more often. But if the cap is too high, it's a redundant passive effect because it's always there. Although I'm not sure that's really a bad thing, it's pretty much always going to be there anyway. Well, it would be, but now there is no external source for festering wounds, it will drop off between sets, and you won't be able to roll over any excess festering wounds. So it's mostly pointless at the moment. The additional runic power would be very useful, and this talent will probably be the go-to option if they fix runes or festering wounds duration. Blighted Runeweapon. Your next 5 successful auto-attacks infect your target with a festering wound. So I assume the idea behind this is to help you burst by letting all your runes be Scourge Strikes, having removed the need for Festering Strike. But it triggers on auto-attack, which is roughly 3 seconds, taking 15 seconds for 5 Festering Wounds. The speed the pet applies it at is faster, and whilst only 50%, it still gives you roughly 5 Festering Wounds over 15 seconds, as well as the rest of the time. This is substantially worse than Infected Claws. Giving it 2 or even 3 Festering Wounds per attack would make it worth looking at, because it would then start to synergize with Castigator and Defile. 58. Unholy Frenzy. When a Festering Wound bursts, your ghoul gains 100% attack speed for 3 seconds. Pet energy is not dependent on pet attack speed, so this is simply a passive DPS boost. Castigator. Each Scourge Strike critical bursts an additional Festering Wound. You can read this as Scourge Strike will sometimes trigger an additional Festering Wound, which will be important later. It will slightly complicate the management of Festering Wounds, since they only stack to 5 and will likely result in more awkwardness when dealing with 1 rune and no Festering Wounds. With no way of creating new runes to turn into a Festering Strike, whether you just dump the Scourge Strike regardless or hold off hoping for more Festering Wounds, will need to be answered later. But it's yet another reason to reinstate Blood Tap. Clawing Shadows. Deals shadow damage to the target and trigger a single stack of Festering Wounds if it is present on the target. Replaces Scourge Strike. This is a ranged Scourge Strike, but it does 30% less damage, showing the steep costs incurred by being able to hit from range, but I tend to find this generally quite useful during questing. This could be an attempted solution to having no mobility, but the damage penalty is incurred even at close range, and since all the other mechanics are built around being in melee range, I would rather they just made this a mobility talent. 60 looks like it could be the control tier, but it's very weak. Sludge Belcher. Raise Dead now summons an abomination instead of a ghoul, with improved innate abilities. Whilst we have no information about this yet, as it's not yet implemented, I would expect that it will inherently do more DPS than the standard pet, so on the basis of that assumption, it looks like they expect everyone to pick Sludge Belcher this tier, and so have put in a couple of competing talents that are completely pointless to PvE raiding. If they wanted to just upgrade the pet at level 60, make it the standard pet, and put in something useful. Asphyxiate. Channel dark energies that lift the enemy target off the ground, crushing their throat and stunning them for 6 seconds, or until your channel ends. Can be channeled while moving. This is on a 2-minute cooldown, 20-yard range. It is of course totally redundant to raiding. If you compare this talent to say Enhancement Shaman, who have Stonefist Strike, an instant 5-second stun on a 30-second cooldown, yes, theirs is melee range only, but adding 90 seconds onto the cooldown and forcing it to be a channel is way too high a cost. Debilitating Infestation. All enemies affected by Outbreak are snared by 50% for 3 seconds. Anything with the debuff Outbreak is snared 50%, so that means it lasts the full 6 seconds of the time Outbreak is up, and then 3 seconds after it ends, which means you can keep something constantly snared as it covers rune sets. But Outbreak, like Plague Strike before it, does basically no damage, and you are repeatedly burning a rune, losing a substantial amount of DPS if you're forced to maintain it, but paired with Clawing Shadows, you can happily do terrible DPS at range to mobs that can never catch you. 75. This tier looks like the damage mitigation tier, but it's disappointing. It's a question of deferring all damage to pet, blocking magic damage, or avoiding it by leaping out the way. Meat Shield. It's a 60-second cooldown, instant. For the next 10 seconds, 90% of all damage you take is transferred to your ghoul. If your ghoul is slain while the spell is active, it cannot be resummoned for 30 seconds. 60 seconds is a decent cooldown for this, but there doesn't appear to be any additional damage reduction added to the effect. So basically you are looking at gaining roughly 50% more health as a buffer with a potentially huge cost. Because if you're using any of the pet talents like Infected Claws, you are relying on your healer to snap heal the pet, which is another bar added to the healer's watch list, and now my DPS is dependent on somebody else's ability to cope. I use this mitigation cooldown like a good boy to absorb the effect that I couldn't run away from because I have no mobility, and now I get punished for it because the healer let the pet die because they're busy trying to keep the tanks alive. And healing pets is something I only see in raids. Pug healers in dungeons generally don't bother. There needs to be some inherent reduction to the damage going to the pet, or remove the block on resummoning, preferably both. With all that being said, currently it isn't transferring any damage to the pet at all, so it's just an awesome cooldown, which would be a great option, but I don't think it'll survive. Spell Eater. Your anti-magic shell is 20% larger and lasts 5 seconds longer. Well, this is a talent any man would want. Death's Flight has a 90-second cooldown, 25-yard range, instant cast where you pull yourself to the location of a friendly player or pet. Replaces Death Grip. I can see this being a particularly contentious issue. They repeatedly make comments saying they don't want every class to have mobility, but every other class has mobility, and some have immunities. DKs have no mobility, and whilst AMS blocks some effects, it isn't an immunity like Deterrence or Cloak. So mobility with DKs is awful, and having looked across the other classes, there have been further increases in their mobility. Shamans get Roll, Outlaw Rogues get Leap, Rep Paladins get the Diablo 3 Crusader ability to mount in combat. I was half expecting Druids to get Leap, but they still have Blink, Charge, Shadow Step, and in fact, they already have this very ability. It's part of a low tier talent, Wild Charge. As non-shifted, fly to an ally's position, and that is on a 15-second cooldown. So whilst the intention to finally give DKs any type of mobility is a great step forwards and needs to be acknowledged as such, it's unfortunate that they went with Jump to Player as a melee, because whilst at face value it looks okay, it's really several kinds of bad. As you know, we only need mobility for two situations: getting to the thing to hit it, and running away from the thing that's going to hit us. This fails at both because, first, the cooldown is just too long, making flight a one-way ticket. Not only have we lost grip, but this is the only way of getting about quickly, and with a 90-second cooldown, we are still screwed. But it would be possible to work around most problems if the cooldown was very, very short, or had multiple charges to escape a mechanic and get back to the boss. The other big problem is that by not being free aiming, it removes all personal power. The requirements of targeting a friendly are just too high, because I can only escape the place where somebody else already is. Therefore, I need to have a guy consistently standing in the right place, macroed for me to leap to, or wait for other melee to escape using their mobility talents and then fly to them. Seriously? That is kind of tragic. But you might say just move the pet out and leap to that. Well, okay, there goes some of my DPS, because my pet, currently the only thing keeping my festering wounds rolling between sets, is now standing in the middle of nowhere, waiting for me to joyfully leap into its arms. When we try to quickly engage bosses, we have the same issues, but now there is nobody to fly to. We have to wait for any other melee class to get to the boss first, and then fly to them. But we can claim back our semi-autonomy. We don't have to sit around waiting to ride the warrior, because yes, the pet has charge. We can send the pet to the boss, then fly to the pet, thus giving us the shittest charge by proxy imaginable, and all for only a 90-second cooldown. This isn't quite what I meant when I asked for pet utility. This isn't a new topic by any means, and yet we still face the same problems. On live, if you grip a warrior with Spell Reflect, it pulls you to them instead, so simply give us the option to toggle grip in either direction, and that immediately resolves how to engage new targets. As for the escape, I don't much care what it is, it just needs to be free aiming with a fast transfer. But I would be curious to see something like the psionic transfer ability from the Protoss Adepts in StarCraft 2, assuming of course the shade moves faster and we can control when to teleport. But if, as I keep reading, that not all classes should have mobility, then DK should have simply the best defensive cooldowns in the game, so they can just sit there and take it to the face. But they don't. DKs are simply sponges for healer mana, and no raid guild should be interested in a class like that. Not when you can pick any other melee class to do exactly the same job, and more than likely do it better. Okay, so after that, let's go back to 90. This tier seems to be another one dealing with increasing your AoE. Shadow Infusion. Dealing damage with Death Coil will decrease the cooldown of Dark Transformation by 2 seconds. This looks aimed at single target, and it's the standard cooldown reduction. It doesn't look like DT will be up 100%, but it'll certainly be up quicker. Necrosis. Death Coil has a 25% chance to cause Virulent Plague to erupt when it damages infected enemies. Well, since eruption hits its triggering target, it's going to be an increase on single target DPS, but it's more likely aimed at council style fights or general AoE after you run out of runes and you're just rolling the dice hoping you get some procs. This is generally my preferred option for questing because you're spending so much time death coiling, and I spend more time using Scourge Strike or Clawing Shadows because Pathogens is just very poor damage. Profane Pathogens. 2 runes, instant cast. Cause all of your Virulent Plague effects to instantly erupt. This looks like a 2-rune Blood Boil. That would have made sense back when runes were different types. Active AoE as Unholy is severely limited in both location and time, being tied to D&D, so this should cover the remaining 20 seconds. Unfortunately, Eruption is split evenly between all targets, so it's just quite disappointing to use. The damage is very low and doesn't beat Scourge Strike during D&D, and just feels like a waste of runes outside of D&D when kiting packs of mobs whilst questing. I find using Clawing Shadows and prepping Festering Wounds for the next D&D to be much more effective, but on the plus side, there is currently no range limit. Tier 100, both Necrotic Plague and Breath of Sinragosa are gone, leaving us with 2 new ones and Defile, the very boring option analogy. I'd say I'll miss Necrotic Plague a lot more than Breath of Sinragosa, and whilst Dark Arbiter isn't implemented, the other 2 don't amount to much currently. Dark Arbiter, 3-minute cooldown, replaces Gargoyle. Summon a Valkyr to assist you in combat. The Valkyr grows more powerful as you spend runic power. This isn't in yet, but if it simply replaces Gargoyle, it'll just do single target DPS. Potentially, it's fairly dull, as you would just store up some runic power beforehand and try and get through as much as possible. As it grows stronger with runic power, you could view this as a kind of breath replacement, as you would be under pressure to feed it as much runic power as possible, but in a much more forgiving style. Defile. Defiles the ground targeted by the Death Knight for 10 seconds. Every 1 second, if there are any enemies standing in the defile, it deals Shadow Frost damage to them, bursts a Festering Wound, and grows in radius and damage. And this replaces Death and Decay. So Defile has survived. It's only marginally more interesting than Warlords, as it now triggers Festering Wounds, which means that when using in single target, it results in some super Festering Strike spam. As for AoE, outside of failing to plan, having it trigger Festering Wounds isn't quite so amazing, because the only way you can AoE is with Scourge Strike, which breaks Festering Wounds, and since Scourge Strike is hitting all targets inside the Defile, it's breaking them all anyway. But in the times where you fail to plan ahead, Defile is there to pop all the Festering Wounds for you whilst you death coil waiting for runes. Soul Reaper. Costs 1 rune, 20-second cooldown, melee range, instant. Strikes an enemy for 85% physical damage. After 5 seconds, up to 3 Festering Wounds on the target will burst. This is a totally pointless, lackluster talent. The initial damage is terrible, and the text means it will trigger 3 Festering Wounds if it's present on the target. If you directly compare this to Defile, that does more damage, triggers all the Festering Wounds on all the targets in the area for 10 seconds, and even the lower tier talent Castigator does this, but with Scourge Strike, and Scourge Strike deals a lot more base damage, and as I wrote there, you can basically read that as a talent that breaks up to 2 Festering Wounds. This needs to be changed out, or given a massive boost. That covers talents. The build I've been running with whilst you've been watching this has been Ebon Fever, Infected Claws, a mix of Castigator and Clawing Shadows, Debilitating Infection, Meat Shield, Profane Pathogens occasionally but mostly Necrosis, and of course Defile. The final choices are entirely dependent on tuning, which hasn't even begun yet, and of course whether any of these talents even survive. I don't want to be needlessly negative, but my conclusions are that unfortunately it's just not great. They have made some very large changes to the core mechanics and then tried to solve the problems that created, with mixed results. Runes are nice and safe now, which I'm happy enough with, but they become less manageable with less haste, and only having access to runic corruption is really quite irritating. The amount of RNG tied into the base mechanics is frustrating, and Festering Wounds just aren't very interesting without any way to manipulate them. But the biggest issue is they haven't solved any of the problems from Warlords. Unholy is still missing mobility, survivability, and burst. Its only redeeming factor in Warlords was its cerebral gameplay, but that has been pruned back so much that anything that offered complication or challenge has been removed. But it's early days, there is a lot of potential in the concepts they have here, we can only wait and see what they come up with. I'll be covering Frost next, which does look a lot more promising, and then at some point I'll take a look at Demon Hunters, and probably a few other things along the way, as I'm going to be keeping an eye on developments in Legion over the coming months. But man cannot live on WoW alone, and in February I'll be starting on XCOM 2, which I'm very excited about. It's a franchise I've been playing for a lot longer than I've been playing WoW. Feel free to leave any comments or questions. Thanks for watching.